My brother-in-law had a way of filling a room that I'd always found exhausting. It wasn't just his voice, though that was loud enough. It was the way he positioned himself at the center of every conversation, the way his hands moved when he talked, conducting some invisible orchestra that only he could hear. At my sister's dinner table in Christchurch, with the good plates out and the candles lit and the lamb roast going cold, because nobody wanted to interrupt him mid-sentence, Marcus Holt was in full flight. The Meridian Group is looking at a 42% growth trajectory by Q3, he said, lifting his wineglass with the kind of casual authority that made it look rehearsed. We're not just talking regional anymore. Auckland, Wellington, Brisbane. The board signed off on the Sydney expansion last Tuesday. My sister Renata beamed at him from across the table. She always beamed when he talked like this. She'd married him 6 years ago, when his commercial property development firm was already established and already impressive, and somewhere along the way, his success had become something she wore like a second skin. My mother nodded along, the way she always did. My uncle poured more wine. My cousin's husband leaned forward with the eager expression of a man hoping to be noticed by someone important, and I sat at the end of the table, quietly cutting my lamb, saying nothing. Zara, Marcus said, turning to me with the particular smile he reserved for moments like this. The patient smile. The generous smile of someone doing you a favor simply by acknowledging your existence. How's the consulting going? The way he said consulting with that slight pause before it, that almost imperceptible softening of the word, told me everything I needed to know about how he described my work to the rest of the table before I arrived. It's going well, I said. Still working from home, yeah? Mostly. Right. He nodded slowly, like a doctor receiving mildly disappointing test results. Good for you. That flexibility must be nice. Especially at your age 26, is it? Plenty of time to figure things out. I was 28. I didn't correct him. Renata laughed softly, the way she did when she wanted to smooth something over without addressing it directly. Zara's always been the independent one, she said, as though that were an explanation, or perhaps an apology. My mother gave me a look from across the table. Not unkind, just careful. She'd been giving me that look my whole life, the look that said, "Don't make a scene. Just let it go. It's not worth it." And for most of my life, I had. I'd let it go. I'd smiled and changed the subject, and driven home afterwards, feeling like something small and vital had been quietly extinguished inside me. That night was no different. I smiled. I finished my lamb. I helped clear the plates. I said goodbye to everyone at the door with the same warmth I always brought to these things, and I drove back to my apartment in the hills above the city, with the radio off and the windows down and the cool Canterbury air coming through. What Marcus didn't know, what none of them knew, because I had chosen not to tell them, was that 3 weeks earlier, I had signed the preliminary term sheet for an acquisition deal worth $14 million. Not as the company being acquired, as the company doing the acquiring. I should explain how it started, because it matters. I'd left university at 22, with a degree in information systems and a very clear sense that the career paths being offered to me were not the ones I wanted. Everyone around me was interviewing for graduate programs at the big consulting firms, the banks, the corporate law offices, safe, structured, well-compensated paths up well-worn ladders. I took a job instead at a tiny Wellington-based data analytics firm called Tuhono, which had 4 employees, including the founder, and smelled permanently of instant coffee and ambition. The pay was modest. The hours were not. My mother told me she was proud of me, but her voice had a particular quality that suggested she was also deeply concerned. Within 18 months, the founder, a quiet, meticulous woman named Dr. Philippa Shand, had made me her operations lead. Not because I was the most technically brilliant person in the room, though I could hold my own, because I understood, instinctively, how to look at a broken process and see not just the problem, but the architecture of the solution. Philippa said I had a rare kind of systems thinking. She said most people see trees. I see the whole forest and the water table underneath it. I learned everything from her. How to read a balance sheet like a story. How to structure a contract so that the power sits where you need it to sit. How to walk into a room full of people who have already decided you're not important and leave that room having changed the terms of the conversation entirely. When Philippa retired at 63 and offered to sell me her 40% stake in the company for a price I could actually reach if I stretched, I didn't hesitate. I was 24. I renamed the company Groundline Advisory. I moved the headquarters to Christchurch to be closer to the South Island infrastructure clients I was beginning to build relationships with. I kept the team small on purpose. 8 people, all of them exceptional. None of them interested in looking impressive. We were interested in being effective. We worked primarily in the unglamorous middle of the business world: water utilities, regional councils, agricultural supply chains, logistics networks, the kind of organizations that the Marcus Holtz of the world would consider beneath their attention, the kind that formed the invisible backbone of how an economy actually functioned. We helped them understand their own data. We built decision frameworks. We identified inefficiencies that were costing them money they didn't know they were losing. We were not flashy. We did not have a marble foyer or a corporate hospitality box at the Cricket. We had a converted warehouse space near the Addington Railway Corridor and a client retention rate of 94%. By the time I was sitting at my sister's dinner table, listening to Marcus describe his 42% growth trajectory, Groundline had quietly become one of the most respected data advisory firms operating in the South Island infrastructure space. Our annual revenue had crossed $4 million the previous financial year. We had been approached twice by larger firms interested in partnership arrangements. I had turned both of them down. The third approach was different. It came from a firm called Harwick Integrated, based in Auckland, which had been trying for 2 years to establish a credible presence in the South Island market. They had the capital, the brand recognition, and the national client relationships. What they didn't have was the local trust, the institutional knowledge, or the operational infrastructure that took years to build. We had all three. Their initial approach came through an intermediary, a corporate finance advisor I'd worked with on a regional council project the previous year. He rang me on a Tuesday afternoon and said, somewhat carefully, that he had been asked to explore whether Groundline might be open to a conversation about a merger. I asked him to clarify the structure they had in mind. He clarified it. I sat with the information for approximately 48 hours, during which time I consulted with my CFO, my legal counsel, and a very good friend from university who had gone into investment banking and owed me a favor from a situation involving a misplaced spreadsheet and a very important client presentation in 2021. Then I rang the intermediary back and said, yes, I was open to a conversation, but I wanted to be clear from the outset. I wasn't interested in being absorbed. I was interested in a merger that preserved Groundline's operational autonomy and recognized the actual market value of what we'd built. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then the intermediary said, I'll pass that on. The negotiations took 11 weeks. I will not pretend they were easy, because they were not. There were 3 separate occasions where I sat in a glass-walled meeting room in Auckland with people who had been doing deals longer than I had been alive, and felt the very particular pressure of being the youngest, the least credentialed by traditional measures, and the only woman at the table. I felt it every time. I just didn't let it change anything. What I had that they needed was irreplaceable. I knew that. The moment you forget what you're worth in a negotiation is the moment you start giving it away. The deal that emerged after 11 weeks was structured as a merger of equals in operational terms, with Harwick providing capital investment and national platform access, and Groundline retaining leadership of all South Island operations under my continuing directorship. The combined entity would operate under a new brand that incorporated both names. The valuation placed on Groundline's contribution to the deal was $14 million. When I signed the preliminary term sheet, I sat in my office afterwards for a long time, not celebrating, just sitting with it. The years of early mornings and late nights, and missed occasions and conversations where I'd nodded politely while someone explained to me, with great patience, why my company was too small to matter. 3 weeks after I signed that term sheet, I went to Renata's dinner. I was not planning to say anything that night. I genuinely wasn't. I had learned, over the years, that the desire to prove yourself to people who have already decided what you are is mostly a way of giving them continued power over you. the deal would close. My life would change. None of it required their acknowledgement. But something happened the following morning that changed the timeline of things. I was at my desk at 7:30, working through the due diligence documentation that Harwick's legal team had sent over the night before, when my phone rang. It was my CFO, a quietly brilliant woman named Bev, who had been with Groundline since the second year and who communicated exclusively in understatement. "You might want to look at your emails," she said. I looked. There was a message from Harwick's lead partner, forwarded through our legal counsel, flagging a complication that had emerged overnight in the due diligence process, not on our side, on theirs. A discrepancy in their Auckland commercial property portfolio, which had been flagged by their auditors as potentially material to the overall deal valuation. I read the email twice. Then I rang Bev back. "How material?" I asked. "Enough to matter," she said. The property portfolio in question included 3 commercial developments in central Auckland. One of them, it turned out, was co-developed through a partnership arrangement with an entity that I recognized immediately, the Meridian Group. I sat very still for a moment. Then I opened a second browser tab and began reading. What emerged over the following 72 hours, as Harwick's due diligence team dug further at my request and our own legal counsel conducted parallel research, was a picture that I found genuinely alarming. The Meridian Group, Marcus's company, the one growing at 42%, the one eyeing Sydney, had structured several of its recent developments through a financing arrangement that was, at minimum, aggressively optimistic about future valuations, and at maximum, something that would concern a regulator with patience and a good forensic accountant. The Auckland development that overlapped with Harwick's portfolio was one of 3. There were potential liability questions. There were questions about how those liabilities had been disclosed or not disclosed in Meridian's most recent investor documents. I want to be careful here, because I am not a lawyer, and this is not a legal finding. What I can say is that our legal counsel, after reviewing the documentation, used the phrase significant exposure more than once and did not appear to be using it loosely. I had a decision to make. I could keep this information within the deal process, flag it to Harwick's team as a risk factor for the overlapping portfolio, allow their lawyers to handle it through normal commercial channels, and proceed with the merger on a revised structure that excluded or quarantined the affected assets. Or I could pick up the phone. I thought about Marcus at the dinner table. His conducting hands, his patient smile, the way he said consulting like it was a word for something endearingly small. I thought about my sister's face when he talked about Sydney. I thought about my mother's careful look across the table, and every other careful look she'd given me across every other table, and all the times I'd driven home with the windows down and the radio off. Then I thought about Renata, because that was the real calculation, wasn't it? Marcus's exposure was Marcus's problem, but Renata's life was built around that problem. Their house, their children's school, the life she wore like a second skin, all of it was downstream of a company that might be significantly more fragile than she knew. I picked up the phone, not to Marcus, to Renata. She answered on the 3rd ring, sounding like she was in the middle of something. "Zara, is everything okay? I need to talk to you about something," I said, "and I need you to listen to me the whole way through before you respond. Can you do that?" A pause. "You're scaring me. I don't mean to, but I need you to hear this, because I think it matters." I told her not everything, because some of it was still subject to legal process, but enough. I told her that in the course of business due diligence, I had come across information about Meridian's financial structure that raised serious questions. I told her she should ask Marcus, directly and specifically, about the Auckland commercial portfolio and the financing arrangements he'd entered into in the past 18 months. I told her she should consider speaking to an independent financial advisor, not Marcus's advisor, an independent one, before making any significant personal financial decisions. She was very quiet throughout. When I finished, she said, "How do you know any of this?" And this is when I told her about Groundline. Not just the consulting business she'd understood it to be, but the full picture, the client roster, the revenue, the merger, the $14 million valuation, the deal that was currently in progress with a national firm that had a direct financial stake in understanding exactly what the Meridian Group's exposure looked like. There was a long silence. $14 million, she said finally. Yes. Another silence. And you just sat there at dinner. I didn't think it was the right time. Zara. Her voice had changed. It wasn't quite the voice she used with me at family dinners. It was older, somehow. More careful. Why didn't you tell us any of this? I thought about how to answer that honestly. Because, I said, I spent a long time building something in a space where people were very comfortable telling me it didn't matter. And I found that the building went better when I stopped explaining it to people who'd already decided. She didn't say anything to that for a moment. Then she said, I'll talk to him. I don't know exactly what happened in the conversation between Renata and Marcus that followed, because she hasn't told me all of it, and I haven't asked. What I know is that within a week, Marcus had engaged a different financial advisor, an independent one, and that advisor's preliminary assessment of Meridian's position confirmed enough of what our due diligence had surfaced that Marcus himself initiated a conversation with his investors about restructuring the Auckland portfolio arrangements. It was not a comfortable process for him. I understand it involved several difficult meetings and at least one conversation with a solicitor that lasted most of a day. The Meridian Group did not collapse, but the Sydney expansion was quietly shelved. The 42% growth trajectory was revised. The hand that had conducted invisible orchestras at my sister's dinner table became, from what Renata described, considerably less animated in the weeks that followed. The Groundline merger closed 8 weeks later on the terms we'd originally agreed, with the Harwick portfolio restructured to remove the affected assets. The combined firm launched publicly, with a small function in Auckland that I flew up for and flew back from the same day because we had client deliverables due that week, and I was not going to let a party get in the way of a deadline. My mother rang me the evening the merger was announced. She'd seen something in the business section of a local news site, a small item, 3 paragraphs, mentioning my name as the founding director of the acquired firm. Why didn't you tell me? She asked. She sounded more confused than hurt. I was going to, I said. I just wanted to wait until it was done. $14 million, Zara. Yes. And Marcus, he's known for how long? He found out around the same time as everyone else. She was quiet for a moment. Then she laughed a short, startled sound, like something she hadn't expected to do. You sat there at that dinner and didn't say a word. It wasn't the right moment. I gave you that look, she said. You did. I thought you were just being. I thought you were letting it go again. I was, I said. Just not in the way you meant. I've thought about that conversation a lot since then. About the difference between letting something go because you don't have the strength to hold it, and letting something go because you're busy using your hands for something more important. There is a version of this story where I went back to that dinner table and corrected everything: Marcus's condescension, my mother's careful look, my sister's reflexive smoothing over of tension, where I laid out the facts and watched the room rearrange itself around them. Where I got the moment, I didn't want the moment. I wanted the outcome. And I think that's something worth sitting with, especially if you're younger, especially if you're in the early stages of building something that the people around you haven't learned yet to take seriously. The hunger to be seen, to be acknowledged, to have someone at the dinner table finally understand what you're worth. That hunger is completely human and completely understandable, but it is also, if you let it drive you, one of the most reliable ways to take your eyes off the thing you're actually building. Your validation does not have to come from the room you're sitting in. It can come from the work. It can come from the $14 million term sheet sitting in your email at 7:30 in the morning, from the client who rings back 4 years running because you've never once let them down, from the knowledge that you built something real in a space where people were comfortable telling you it didn't matter. The people who underestimate you quietly are often doing you a favor. They leave you alone. They don't crowd your thinking with their expectations or their skepticism or their need to have opinions about your choices. They let you work. Marcus Holt thought he understood the landscape. He had the vocabulary, the wine, the conducting hands, the growth trajectory rehearsed for dinner tables. What he didn't have was the thing underneath: the genuine understanding of how systems work, how value accumulates quietly over time, how the businesses nobody bothers to look at twice can sometimes turn out to be the most important ones in the room. The world is full of people making noise about what they're building. The most interesting buildings are usually constructed in silence. If you're working on something right now that the people around you can't quite see yet, if you're sitting at someone's dinner table, listening to someone explain the landscape to you with patient condescension, swallowing a smirk, stay the course. Do the work. Let the term sheet arrive in its own time. And when it does, you don't even have to say anything. The paperwork will speak for itself. If you found something in this story that stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. There's someone in your life right now building something quietly. They might need to know that the silence is allowed, that it's not invisibility, it's patience. And patience, compounded over years, is one of the most powerful forces I know. I'll see you in the next chapter.